What I'm talking about actually does follow on a lot more than I thought it would from what Siobhan was saying, in that she was talking about this problem of the way we've let our research base decline in this country. And it's certainly true that in the period she was talking about work at Rothamsted, for example, when Colin Butler and John Stevenson were developing the protocols for looking at the effect of pesticides on bees and that important stuff, and Dr. Bailey was doing all his pioneering work on bee viruses. In the economic climate then, science was seen as important for its own sake, and an organisation like Rothamsted received a block grant from the government, and scientists such as Dr. Bailey essentially were given a pot of money that they could spend on whatever they thought was interesting. And so in practice, Bailey would spend about 50% of his time in the lab doing research, and the other 50% of his time writing papers and books and things like that. Times have changed, and a similar researcher these days probably spends about 70% of their time filling in grant applications, trying to find some money to do some work. They get very little time in the lab and very little time to write it up, and it's very different. And I think it was a much healthier atmosphere in the 1960s that people could collaborate with each other. And if you look at the output that was done in those days, okay, there weren't government inspectors finding out precisely what was going on and whether the work was value for money. I think a lot of the work that was done there was exceptionally good value for money, and a lot of stuff came out of it. And unfortunately, these days, with researchers chasing an ever-decreasing pot of money, they don't want to talk to each other for fear they may give away some good idea that somebody else will pinch and grab some of that very small pot of money. And it's very sad that science has become this way. So what I'm going to talk about actually is a slightly different way of doing scientific work. And I'm actually going to be talking about scientists talking to each other. And there'll be lots of pictures of groups of scientists in various exotic locations and so on. But it is important that scientists talk to each other in order not to reinvent the wheel. So the starting point for what I'm going to talk about follows on precisely from the point that was made just then. In 2006, the bee pathology group at Rothamsted were all made redundant, and we got kicked out. It was mainly because Varroa had been taken off the statutory list, and therefore the government deemed that Varroa was not something that it was worth spending any money on. So the work we've been doing on biocontrol and things like that all came to an end, and nobody's picked it up since. And we had actually been saying that there is a problem with bees, that Varroa is quite a problem and colonies may die. And very shortly afterwards, 2007 and so on, the world's headlines were full of all these stories about the demise of bees and how the world's going to come to an end, and how Einstein predicted that we'd all starve if there were no bees around and so on. And it became clear that there was a big problem with bees, lots of colonies dying. But the problem is really that bees do that from time to time. Bees are insects, and one of the characteristics of insect populations is that they fluctuate wildly from year to year. So yes, you could point to those headlines and say there's a problem with bees in the United States, but is that unusual? And this is some data that some Americans put together at around that time, looking at historical losses. And so they pointed out that in 1868, in the United States, in similar places to where some of these losses were occurring, there were huge losses. And then, of course, in this country, more than 100 years ago now, we had the Isle of Wight disease that supposedly wiped out vast proportion of the colonies in Britain, and many documented major losses of bees around the world over the last 100 years or so, and indeed some quite recently. So the question was, is there anything new that's going on, and are these losses exceptional, or are they just part of the pattern of life? So a group of scientists got together to try and study these losses, and we're quite good at criticising the EU for many things and their bureaucratic meddling and so on, but actually the EU does support beekeeping in quite a large way, and it's also supported bee science through a number of programmes. And so in 2008, an organisation called COST, which is the Commission Organisation for Science and Technology, actually put some money into a thing called the Colos network. And this was originally a project funded under a cost action, they call them, to set aside a sum of money for scientists to meet together and discuss the problems of colony losses. And it started off as a tiny little group of mainly European scientists, but it grew, and this was a map from fairly early on in the project. And you can see there are quite a few countries represented, and this was the logo that came up. Somebody asked me who this chap is. So this is the Coloss of Rhodes here, and he's got a beehive in his hand and a comb, and EU projects have to have silly acronyms and so on. So Colos was the name that was devised for this EU action. And in the first phase of this project, which ran from 2008 till 2012, when the EU money ran out, it was really incredibly productive. And there was something like 320 members from 59 countries, and a large proportion of those people involved were young people in various ways. They called them early stage researchers is the definition, but essentially PhD students and people who've postdocs and other people who are starting out in their career. And something like 130 refereed scientific publications came out of that period, and many popular articles trying to translate that into a form for beekeepers and other stakeholders. So that was the first period of the project, and I think there was always a slight suspicion that with EU money available to organise meetings, that possibly some people were just coming along to the meetings to travel the world and talk to people. But it was a different way of doing work. So the Colos network has never provided any actual money for doing research. What it does is it enables people to talk to each other through a series of networking opportunities. And the members of Colos are bee scientists, but also advisors and other people who have some sort of professional input among bee science. So the tools available primarily were conferences, so annual get-togethers where people can discuss things a bit like this and so on, but also other workshops where a smaller group of people will assemble in some place to thrash out techniques, learn new techniques, and then what they called short-term scientific missions, which were generally where an individual scientist went to work at another institute to learn some new techniques, to develop some new technique and so on. And Colos also organised a number of training schools for scientists to learn techniques and for advisors and so on. And then from time to time they made announcements and position statements and so on. And this was all an incredibly productive way of working. So when the EU money ran out in 2012, by that time I was quite involved in it, and we thought, well, this is too good to lose. We've got to carry on with this, even though we don't have the EU money available. So we had a meeting in Athens there, as you can see, and we decided that we would carry on and reorganise things. And currently, we have 475 members representing 70 different countries around the world. And that is a lot of scientists doing things. And we've actually set ourselves up as a non-profit making organisation. And because the chairman happens to be at the University of Bern in Switzerland, it seemed convenient to set it up as a non-profit making body under Swiss law. So that is the sort of organisation of the thing, and this is a wonderful map that Peter Neumann, who's the president, came up with. And basically the idea is there's this central committee, and then there are various themes studying the reasons for colony losses, and then particular projects to fulfill this, and various task forces for particular purposes. And I'm going to go through some of the sort of major things that Colos has done in that time. So this was the last meeting at Murcia in Spain last year, and it's worth bearing in mind that since we now have very limited funding, everyone made their own way to that meeting. There was no money to pay for their travel or hotel bills or whatever. It's the researchers wanting to talk to each other and wanting to work together. And so it's been a very refreshing way of working in that individuals from a particular country are not chasing the same pot of money as they usually are. They're actually talking to each other, deciding to do something, and then they have to go back and find the funds to actually take part in that collaborative project, some of which are quite big and quite costly. And I think it's a really unusual way for scientists to work, and doesn't tend to happen these days. This is our website, which you can find all sorts of useful stuff on. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the colony loss monitoring. And I started out by saying that we know that honeybee colony losses have occurred from time to time in various places, and therefore how do we know whether what's happening now is unique? And there was a certain amount of data from different countries where odd surveys had been done and so on, but the problem was that every survey had been done in a slightly different way, and therefore it's very difficult to compare the data that's come from it. So the first thing the colony loss section of COLOS did was to have a number of meetings to discuss standard ways of actually collecting and recording data. And they came up with these standard questionnaires, which have been refined a little bit over the years, but the idea is that in every country these forms would be sent out to beekeepers and they would fill them in, and then the data could be analysed on a countrywide basis, but more importantly it could be analysed on as large a basis as possible. And these standard questionnaires have been adopted in 20-something different countries worldwide. There have been surveys going on in the United States for a couple of years before this, and those have sort of joined in on a standard format, and then new countries have joined recently, so South Africa and a few other countries have joined in very recently. And the first sort of fruits of this were in a special issue of the Journal of Apicultural Research that was put out in 2010, and one of the surveys from the United States was in there, and then this was a paper I persuaded David Aston of the British Beekeepers Association to write, using some of the survey data that the amateur beekeepers here had been collecting for a few years. And then this was the first sort of joint paper from the COLOS group, but also included Canada, China, Israel, Turkey. And you'll see Selwyn Wilkins from the National Bee Unit is here as an author, and the UK was actually involved in that survey. And then more surveys from the United States, and so this is the most recent one that came out last year, 2012 to 13 from the United States, and then this is the COLOS one. And we're in the situation now where there's about 5 years quite good data from both the United States and Europe that actually gives us some understanding of what's going on. Well, sort of. This is a map from the European one, just looking at 2012-13, and essentially the darker the red is, the worse the losses were in that year. And it's interesting that there's a big blank where England and Wales are, and that's not because no data was collected. In fact, there are two sets of data being collected in England and Wales. There's the BBK survey that is sent out to a random proportion of their members each year, and then there's the survey that the National Bee Unit is carrying out through BeeBase. But it's no point just collecting data if you don't make it available. Is very relevant here, and for various reasons that I don't entirely understand, the data from England and Wales has not been submitted recently, and it makes it very difficult to get the big picture. The big picture is that there doesn't seem to be any very clear pattern either in the United States or Europe. Here in this year, Scotland had very heavy losses, but in other years they won't have, and in other years the heavy losses occur in other places. And exactly the same pattern seems to be occurring in the United States, where you get very heavy losses in one area one year, and then the next year that area has lower losses and there are heavy losses elsewhere. There doesn't seem to be any very strong regional pattern in either the United States or Europe. But now there's a reasonable body of data available, it is possible to try and start analysing some of the factors that might be important. And I think where they've looked at Varroa control, it shows very clearly that Varroa is the major factor influencing variation from year to year in colony losses. And on that, you have, of course, the weather, which imposes its pattern. And I don't think there's any doubt that the last few years' data from the United States that shows very heavy losses in one year and very light losses the next year is almost entirely down to the weather. But they are beginning to get some other insights into what might be going on, and questions about what crops are nearby and so on seem to be yielding some results, in that there seems to be some evidence that heavier losses are associated with places where bees have access to mass flowering crops such as maize and oilseed rape. And there are several possible explanations for that. The one, of course, that will spring to mind is that maize and oilseed rape are treated with neonicotinoid insecticides, and therefore this is proof that neonicotinoid insecticides are killing the bees. And that is possible, and had I the time, I'm sure we could discuss that for hours and hours. But there are other explanations as well. One of these is that those mass flowering crops tend to be grown in areas of monoculture where there is very little other forage available for the rest of the year when those mass flowering crops are not flowering. And not only that, we know that oilseed rape and maize are not very good nutritionally for bees. The pollen of maize is deficient in one particular essential amino acid for bees, and experimental work has been done where people have kept bees on maize pollen and they've added that missing essential amino acid, and the bees still don't do well. So there's something else going on there as well. These are not good nutritionally, and I shall come back to that when talking about another project in a minute. So the next bit I want to talk about is the Colos Bee Book, and this stems from a realization very early on that it wasn't only collecting data from beekeepers that was all done on an inconsistent fashion around the world. Almost everything else that bee scientists did was done in an inconsistent fashion. So studies that were looking at a particular disease in one country would have been done one way, and another study by another scientist in another country on the same disease would have used completely different techniques, and it's very, very difficult to compare the results when everyone's doing different things. So really very early on in the Colos project, it was decided that it would be a really good idea to try and standardize on methods for doing things. And the original idea was that it could just be something on the website where everyone could write on their favourite methods, and you had a sort of Wikipedia approach where you could go on and could update the methods and so on. And that didn't really work for a number of reasons. Not least, I think, that scientists wanted some credit for actually putting their ideas on there, and that generally scientists get recognition for publishing research in refereed scientific journals where there's some sort of quality control. So the idea that was eventually hit on was to publish a series of review papers in a scientific journal, in this case the Journal of Apicultural Research, on all these different topics, which would then be collected together in a book. And the project grew, and it ended up as 2 mighty tomes of some 900 pages, written by 250 or so scientists from around the world who were the respected authorities on those particular aspects. And really it has become the definitive guide to carry out on research on honeybees. And this is volume 1, which was sort of on general methods, volume 2 on methods for looking at bee diseases. Volume 3, which is currently being produced, is on hive products, and ultimately the idea is there will be similar volumes relating to other bees, such as working on bumblebees, solitary bees and stingless bees, although that may be a little bit off. But these books have actually been very well received by the scientific community. We printed a limited number of hard copies of these, and actually I sold the last copy of volume 1 from the Ibrastad yesterday. There are a few copies of volume 2 available, but thanks to a grant from the EU, all of the papers in there are available to download free of charge from both the IBRA website and the Colos website, so you can go and look at them. They weren't intended for beekeepers particularly, they were intended for bee scientists, but a lot of beekeepers have actually been looking at them, and we have plans to make some of them more accessible for beekeepers, which I shall come on to in a minute. Now, the next bit I want to talk about is sustainable bee breeding. And when Colos started, there were discussions about which are the possible factors that we should be looking at. And one of the ones that came out of it was the question of whether some strains of bee are more resilient to others, and whether part of the reason for regional losses is that in certain places people are keeping unsuitable types of bee. And so various bits of work came out of that, and this was an early paper which was looking at really how we tell what kind of bee we've got in different places, and setting down the state of knowledge about what types of bee are present in different parts of Europe. And I initially wasn't involved in this at all, and it was sent to the journal for editing, and I was rather appalled that nobody from the UK had contributed anything. And it struck me that perhaps we don't value what we've got in this country very much, in that you've got all these tiny little countries. I mean, you've got some big European countries like France and Greece there and so on, but you've got tiny little places like Macedonia and all these formerly war-torn parts of Europe, tiny little countries where they're all immensely proud of the local bees they have in their little countries, and they know a vast amount about them. Maybe nationalistic reasons come in, that they're very proud to have their own particular race of bee, which somebody standing a little way looking at it dispassionately might think is just the same bee that they've got in the neighbouring country and so on. But nonetheless, there is huge interest in what bees there are in different countries. And so I ended up writing a little bit about the UK and the Republic in Ireland that basically said that we don't really know that much about our bees in this country. And in fact, certain authorities such as Natural England tend to think that honeybees are not native and that we shouldn't really worry too much about them because other bees are much more important. And in any case, if there were any native honeybees, they were got rid of many years ago by imports of bees from around the world and so on. And we don't really have a particularly well-organised queen rearing industry, and we don't really know what's going on very much. This sort of brings me on to the question of, well, what bee is best? And if you get a group of beekeepers together in a room, and particularly if you give them some beer and some wine, they will start arguing about things. And one of the things that beekeepers most commonly argue about, wherever you are around the world, is what is the best type of bee? And people will argue vociferously that the type of bee they use is better to any others. And I am being quite careful what I say here, because I know there are quite a number of people in this room who have carried out very extensive studies under their own conditions of particular strains of bee and know what they think are best for them. But nonetheless, most of those arguments that go on among beekeepers from around the world are based on almost total ignorance, because until very recently nobody has really carried out any comparative trials under standardized conditions of different strains under the same condition. So the idea of this experiment, which was called the Genotype Environment Interactions experiment, was to do just that. And so this is a map of 16 different sites around Europe. So some of these places are quite well known for bee breeding, such as Carreck2 here in Germany. Some of these are bee research institutes, universities and so on. You will notice that the UK isn't there at all, and this is unfortunate. I didn't know about this experiment until after it had started, because it would have been really good if we at Sussex University could have taken part in it, but it was too late by the time I found out about it. But the idea was to take 16 strains of bees from 16 different places in Europe and test those under standardized conditions. So at each of those sites there were 10 colonies of the local bee, whatever it may be, and 10 colonies of 2 other strains from within the experiment. And somebody asked me how did they select these? And these were the strains that at that site they thought might do best. So they weren't testing bees from Norway in Avignon. At Avignon, they found 2 strains that were reasonably local and they thought ought to do quite well there. And so for 3 years, these bees were tested under standardized conditions. They measured brood production, populations, honey yield, various aspects of disease control. So they were not treated for Varroa. If they died, obviously they came out of the experiment, but also if they were about to die from Varroa, they were removed from the experiment. So survival was one of the key things that was being looked at. And so last year in May, in a special issue of the Journal of Apicultural Research, the results of this experiment were published. This is the introduction to the whole thing. And again, some money was got together, so all of the main papers coming out of this experiment are available free of charge to download from the IBRA website. And I encourage you to have a look at them because the results are very complex. There's a huge amount of data came out of it. And although I'm just about to tell you some of the principal results, the devil is always in the detail with these things, and they're well worth a look. So this is the sort of detailed map of what strain was used where. So essentially, there were these 16 strains that covered the subspecies of bees that are common in Europe, so the Carniolan bees, the Italian bees, Apis mellifera mellifera, then Macedonica from Greece, and also Sicula from Sicily. And in several cases, there were several different populations of the same subspecies. So these are all Carniolan ones, for example, from several different places, from Germany right across the sort of heartland, former Yugoslavia, and so on. So the different strains of different subspecies. And as I say, colony survival was one of the key things looked at. And this is looking at all the different locations, and you can see that there were huge differences in survival between different locations, but there's no really clear pattern. It sort of falls on a real continuum there, but it shows that in general, site is really quite important in the survival of the bees. And this is looking at the different genotypes, and there's a couple that are sort of outliers. This one here did really badly, this one here did really well, but most of them, there doesn't seem to be any clear difference between the different strains of bees and the different populations of those different subspecies of bees from different places. The one that is consistent, though, is the blue line, the non-local populations. So at each site, that'll be 2 of the groups that were there, and the green is the local populations. And consistently, at every site, the local bees did better in terms of survival than the non-local ones. Now, a lot of effort was put into understanding why that might be, and I haven't got time to go through it, but there's 2 whole papers about disease incidence, and essentially what they showed is that there seems to be huge and fairly inconsistent variation in disease by site. So, for example, at certain sites, none of the bees had any viruses. At others of the sites, all of the bees had lots of viruses. And it seems to be a very clear sort of site effect that occurs there. And possibly if you did the experiment in another year, you would get different results. In terms of looking at the strains of bee, there was no evidence that any strain of bee is particularly or consistently more or less disease resistant than the others. However, there was one site in Greece where they did a lot more detailed study of the disease incidence, and this seemed to suggest that whilst the same diseases were present in all the, in fact, 4 strains of bee that were in that study, they have the same diseases. The incidence of those diseases in the non-local bees seems to be greater than it was in the local bees. In other words, the local bees seem to be less susceptible to the local strains of disease. And I suppose that makes a lot of sense. So that does seem to be the major factor that was leading to this clear effect on survival. Now, as bee farmers, of course, you'll be interested in whether those local bees were better from a bee farming point of view. And this is one graph that I picked out, and this, of course, is the honey yield, which is important. And it does seem to show consistently. So these are your Carniolan bees here, these are your Italian bees here, and they do consistently seem to produce more honey than the Macedonica bees and the Apis mellifera mellifera. So this probably does confirm what you as bee farmers already know, that these strains of bee do produce more honey. And you have to weigh up really whether, because they produce more honey, they are better for you. And if you're having to replace these bees very frequently because they don't survive, you have to weigh up the two, but it's certainly worth considering. This bottom one is looking at the location of the bees, and generally honey yields seem to be higher in the warm places, as you might expect, but they also seem to do pretty well in the cold places, and that's probably because they have a longer day length in the summer. They have a shorter season than we do here, but those bees really do seem to pack in the honey. And then you've got the sort of intermediate places with intermediate honey yield, and that was quite an interesting little result that came out of it. But there are other studies that have gone on, and this was one that I was involved with, which was looking at dark European bees and really looking from a conservation point of view whether it's possible to actually protect these populations. So it looked at a number of populations of dark bees that in theory have some kind of legal protection, and other populations that don't have. And so this is where samples came from. So the red dots are all places which supposedly have some protection. So over here is the island of Læsø off Denmark, which has these black bees which in theory have legal protection, but there has been certain controversy over the years. This up here is Andrew Abraham's bees on Colonsay, which he's been striving to protect for the last 10 or more years, and are now legally protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And then there were two populations that were unprotected. The population from southern France, which is supposedly wonderful, Varroa-tolerant Apis mellifera mellifera, and some of our bees from Sussex University, which again are an unprotected population. These originally came from the Peak District and were brought down to Sussex in 2008, where they will have been mixing with other beekeepers' bees around. And then there were reference populations from Italy and Carniolan territory here. And this is some of the results. So each of these along the bottom is one of the sampling sites. So these over here are the reference samples. So you've got Italy, Croatia and Serbia. So these are your Carniolan bees, and these are your Ligustica bees, the yellow and the red basically. And the blue is Apis mellifera mellifera. So we have here population from Norway, which turns out to be, as near as damn it, pure Apis mellifera mellifera. And these are Andrew's bees from Scotland, and you can see that he is indeed justified in saying that they are pure Apis mellifera mellifera because they come out beautifully. This is the population from France here that was supposed to be these wonderful Apis mellifera mellifera bees, and you can see they're mostly not. They're almost entirely something else that's introgressed, and that shows that in that situation they're not being preserved. But interestingly, these are our bees from Sussex here, and as I say, they've been in Sussex and mixing with other things for a few years, but they are predominantly Apis mellifera mellifera, but with a bit of introgression from Italian and other bees, which is quite interesting and pleasing, and perhaps emphasises that there are subtle mechanisms that mean that bees don't get mixed up in quite the way that everyone might expect, in terms of when queens fly and other such things, which we could talk about if we had time, but we don't. And finally on this topic, this is another paper which just came out from the same group, really trying to set down standards for how you would assess the quality of queens. And again, I think we're years behind in Britain in terms of trying to do this. In other countries in Europe where they churn out vast quantities of queens that they sell for a lot of money and so on. There are in many cases quite well regimented, government organised methods for assessing queen quality, and this was an attempt to sort of set it down on paper. This was just a few weeks ago in Carreck2 in Germany, where I joined this group to discuss the way forward. And I said when I was talking about the bee book that we wanted to make the bee book more accessible for beekeepers. And the 3 chapters that immediately sprang to mind in this were the chapter on queen rearing, the chapter on instrumental insemination, and the chapter on discriminating between different bee populations. And we originally thought, well, we could just sort of put them together with some pretty pictures and say it's a book for beekeepers. But over the last couple of years since we've been talking about this, the idea has actually grown. And I think it's grown in the sort of political climate that I sort of hinted at, where people don't view honeybees very favourably compared to other pollinators, and you could see that in the national pollinator strategies that have come out recently. And among other things, there have been some papers suggesting that disease can be transmitted by moving bees from place to place, which we know, and in particular one paper by some former colleagues of mine that I respect greatly, suggesting that movement of honeybees can bring in disease that can infect bumblebee colonies. The paper doesn't actually prove that, it simply proves that they have the same diseases. And the movement of commercial bumblebee colonies likewise can move disease around the world. And I think the climate is moving against the mass movement of bees around the world. And the final section I shall mention also emphasises that moving things around is not a terribly good idea. And I think the work on breeding local bees and showing that local bees survive better is quite applicable to beekeeping in Europe, but also probably applies in the United States. And there's a chap, a Canadian, Pierre Giovinazzo, who's there somewhere, who joined this group to give it the Canadian perspective. And I had discussions with him, and he was saying, well, of course, the honeybee's not native in North America, so this local breeding thing doesn't apply to us. And it doesn't apply to them in the sense that they have these massive queen rearing industry in, say, Florida that's exporting thousands of queens all over North America. But is that necessarily the best way to do things? And I don't think we could say that the methods of commercial beekeeping in the United States have been entirely successful. And I can't help feeling that some of the colony losses they've experienced over there do have rather a lot to do with the way they keep their bees. And bees have been in North America for quite a long time now, and it does seem quite logical that there are, in fact, locally adapted strains of bee out there that are worthy of investigation. So what we plan to do is to put together a book for beekeepers that will cover all of these themes of how to do bee breeding and so on, but also to make people think of a slightly different way of keeping their bees, and that hopefully will be put together fairly soon. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a citizen science project that I've got involved with, and citizen science has already been mentioned, and this is an opportunity for beekeepers to take part, and some of my colleagues came up with this idea of calling it CSI pollen as a citizen science investigation. And to go back to those colony loss surveys that I mentioned, as I say, the data seems to suggest that there are increased losses associated with access to mass flowering crops such as oilseed rape and maize. And it could be that pesticides are involved, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but it could also be that the reason is that those bees have a very low diversity of food available to their bees, and the food they are getting is of limited nutritional value. So wouldn't it be good to find out more information about pollen diversity in different countries? And in fact, there's remarkably little information about pollen diversity in this country. There are a few surveys and there's a little bit of information, but there's not a vast amount, and the information there is pretty ancient. So it would be possible for a few researchers to do a little bit of work analysing pollen, but how on earth do you do a Europe-wide survey? And this is where the beekeepers came in. So the idea was really to identify regions with high or low pollen diversity, to look at that through the season, to look at seasonal changes, and to compare different habitats. So we wanted citizen scientists who would be beekeepers, and all they need is 3 colonies of honeybees, preferably in the same place for the whole year, ideally. 3 pollen traps, an email address and internet access, a willingness to collect and analyse pollen every 3 weeks throughout the season, and decent colour vision. And unfortunately, quite a large proportion of the male population are colourblind, so that is a prerequisite. And essentially, all that was needed was that roughly 10 times a year over every 3 weeks, you put pollen traps on your colony, you collect a 20-gram pollen sample, and the high-tech measure that my colleagues in Europe came up with is the standard EU honey jar. And of course, would you believe that we use different honey jars in Britain? This is actually the size that you get on the 12-ounce hexagonal jars, happens to be the standard EU size. The 1 pound honey jars are the wrong size. And that conveniently collects you a 20-gram sample. And then all you do is you divide it up into the different number of pollen colours by eye. And then you report your results on the website. And we give full instructions. In terms of pollen traps, last year I expected my volunteers to find their own pollen traps, but since then we've got a small amount of money from the CB Dennis Trust to buy some traps. So we have a limited number of traps to lend to people for the survey, and so you need your 3 colonies. And this is the kind of typical sample you get. This was some work we did at Sussex. So you get clear things like this. This is Phacelia, nice and clear. And then you get 2 oranges that look the same, but are in fact different. One of those is sunflower, and one of those is some yellow composite. And the problem, of course, is that the number of colours you get is not directly related to the number of pollen sources that are there, and I shall come back to that. But nonetheless, it does give you an indication of the diversity. And so this was a meeting we held in Austria at the beginning of last year, and all those people got enthusiastic and went back to their own countries to organise it. So these were all the countries that were involved. These people in the Netherlands and Austria are the overall organisers. I'm the coordinator for England and Wales. Somebody else is doing Scotland and Ireland. And last year, we actually had 21 countries taking part. There were 415 citizen scientists, 316 actually submitted most of the samples, and we ended up with about 8,000 pollen samples. Now, for scientists to have collected those 8,000 samples would have required quite a lot of funding, and so you know, that was pretty well done. And that was really only the start. We hope to get more people next year. So this is the spread. The red dots are where people successfully completed the course, as it were. You can see there are certain hot spots, and this is just the British Isles, so there are quite a few gaps I would quite like to fill. And I've put an article in Beecraft and BBK News, and I've actually been overwhelmed with volunteers, more volunteers than I've actually got traps available. This is just very preliminary results from last year. Just an obvious thing that sprung out. So the red colours are the abundant colours where there are more than a certain number of pollen loads, and this is the total one. And essentially it just very preliminarily shows that the diversity peaks in sort of about June and declines thereafter. We probably knew this already, but this kind of work will actually enable us to have a much more detailed study. So we met again a few weeks ago in Denmark, and the plan is to carry on with more volunteers this year, but also to try and fill in the gaps of our understanding about how the number of colours you get, which is a sort of measure of pollen diversity, actually relates to the different species that are there. So it was always the intention to analyse as many of the samples as we could properly to actually see what species they are. And I'm pleased to say that Asli Özkerim from Turkey here very kindly volunteered to analyse all the samples from England, Wales and Scotland for nothing. And so she and her colleagues are working through those now. And colleagues in Italy are working on ways of modelling the results to actually get some sort of coefficients between the number of colours you get and the number of species you get. I have this gut feel that from Britain it's probably a roughly 1-to-1 ratio, in that some colours are more than one species and some species have more than one colour. But that may well not be the case everywhere, and hopefully all will be revealed in due course. So I just want to report on the value of a group like Colos is that when something new happens, it can actually spring into action quite quickly to do something about a problem. So this is our friend, the small hive beetle, which I'm sure you know quite a bit about, and its history in various places where it's been a problem. This, quite close to home, was Portugal in 2004, where some queen cages came in, supposedly legitimately, and were found to contain small hive beetles, and they were destroyed very rapidly, and the problem went away. And they've looked since in the same place, and there was a very thorough study done in Spain very recently which didn't find the small hive beetles. So that seems to have been a successful eradication of it. But unfortunately, in September this year in Italy, southwest Italy, they were not quite so lucky, because they found this kind of thing, larvae, which clearly suggests that small hive beetle has been there quite a while. And so they confirmed it officially. Has to go through all the EU regulations and has to be confirmed by the EU reference laboratory in France, and so on and so forth. And this is the most recent map to date, although it has to be said they stopped looking for it at the start of January, and they've only just started looking for it again. So it may appear that nothing's happening, but I suspect that's not the case. So it was initially found sort of here in southwest Italy, the Calabria region. There was one case found in Sicily, but they know that it came directly from there, and they followed it up. So they've imposed a 20-kilometre zone around it and a 100-kilometre observation zone. So the good signs are that it's not been found outside that 20-kilometre radius, apart from this one they know about. But the bad signs are that larvae were found showing that it's gone through several generations, and also it has been found in a wild honeybee colony, which is not a good sign. So there have been lots of scenes like this in Italy. Commercial beekeepers have had their hives destroyed and in some cases lost their livelihood. Colos, we moved quite quickly, and we put out this press release in November, rather bravely perhaps, saying the small hive beetle is in Europe to stay. Whether we're right or not, I don't know. And it's fair to say that through the time Colos has been going, the small hive beetle has not been at the head of the agenda, and nobody's been terribly interested in it. And colleagues of mine in Switzerland and Florida and so on, who've wanted to do a lot more work on small hive beetle, have been told, well, it's not really very interesting, it's not of economic importance, so don't do it. But nonetheless, quite a lot of work has been done. In 2008, there was this special issue of the Journal of Apicultural Research devoted to the small hive beetle, and the editorial here has been quite widely quoted and actually plotted the distribution of the beetle up to that point. And then in the Colos Bee Book, there is actually a whole chapter on standard methods for small hive beetle research, which quite fortuitously some Mexican people just volunteered to translate into Spanish, just in time, I suppose. And what we want to do is to put together a collection of papers from Bee World and the Journal of Apicultural Research on the small hive beetle, to put all those papers that have been done in one place. And this was the latest issue of Bee World, which had an update about the outbreak written by Franco Mutinelli, who's the head of the Italian reference laboratory for bees, and indeed a paper describing the outbreak and what's been done. But Colos immediately decided that it ought to set up a group to look at small hive beetles, so a workshop and extension day was organised at very short notice and held a couple of weeks ago in Bologna, and all these scientists attended, including most of the people from around the world who've actually practical experience either of dealing with small hive beetle in its native range, have done experimental work, and people responsible. So Peter Neumann from Switzerland has probably done more research than anyone else on small hive beetle, mainly in South Africa, but also in Australia. Then Franco Mutinelli, who runs the Italian reference laboratory and has the unenviable task of administering the situation at the moment. Marie-Pierre Chauzat, who's head of the EU reference laboratory in France. Jeff Pettis, formerly head of the USDA bee group, who has extensive experience of what it's done in the United States and how they actually live with it now. Christian Perk from South Africa, whose extensive experience of how it actually behaves in its native range. And Luis, somebody whose name escapes me for the minute, from Mexico, who really showed what a dramatic pest it is actually in Mexico at the moment. So conventional story is that the small hive beetle is not a problem in sub-Saharan Africa because Africanized bees are resistant to it, but in Mexico they have African bees and they have the small hive beetle, which has crept down from Texas, and there was fairly heated discussions. The Italian government has promised compensation to beekeepers who've had their hive destroyed, but it hasn't actually been paid yet, and that will only be compensation for the loss of equipment and the bees. It will not be compensation for loss of earnings. And so irrespective of whether or not further fines are made, the very extensive queen rearing and package bee industry in southern Italy will not be able to sell any of their products this year, and that will mean a number of businesses going out of business, I suspect. So a hot topic. We came up with some conclusions and recommendations essentially to say that actually we need more research in a number of key areas, in particular how to diagnose the thing properly, but also some fundamental questions we don't know the answers to, like how far this thing flies. The adult beetle is known to fly quite well. It's possible it flies up to 10 kilometres. It tends to fly at night, so nobody has really seen it, but clearly that has a key importance as to how you control these things. And the wandering larval stage, they wander quite a long way, but again, there are no hard and fast figures on this. There was a lot of discussion about at what point you decide the outbreak is out of control and you move from a policy of destruction to a policy of trying to stop it spreading further and then trying to live with it. And I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. Jeff Pettis from the States suggested that what people should do is they should go out and inspect all the colonies now, but when they find a case they should make a note of it but not actually do anything until it becomes clear how extensive the outbreak is, and then you could either destroy all those colonies or give up. But unfortunately there's nothing in the legislation that allows that to be done. So almost certainly if they find new cases they will be destroyed, and somebody at some point has to make a decision of when you give it up as a bad job or you carry on destroying colonies. And I think the key point that came out really is that the cooperation of the beekeeping industry is needed to get anywhere. It became very clear that the cooperation between the beekeepers and the authorities is very, very fragile at the moment, and it only needs to be, taken a little bit too far, and beekeepers will tend to not cooperate any further. And what we want to do is to put all the presentations that all those scientists made at the meeting into a book for beekeepers, along the lines of these books on Varroa that IBRA has published over the years. And finally, just to sort of keep you up to date, our honeybee disease identification cards that we produced a few years ago, we've just updated those to include the small hive beetle as well. So just to show that an organisation like Colos can actually react quite quickly to a new situation, and arguably quicker than governments can. So I just want to finish by thanking the people who funded Colos over the years. So initially, as I say, it was funded by the EU through the European Science Foundation and COST. That money came to an end. The current funding is through a thing called the Ricola Foundation, the people that make those throat sweets and so on. They've given us quite a bit of money, and the University of Bern. But we are also looking for other sources of funding, and a leading Swiss food manufacturer is showing signs of interest at the moment. So what we would like to do is to get some long-term funding to keep this thing going. Not necessarily a huge amount of funding, but something that gives a long-term commitment. And finally, there are some websites. The papers I've mentioned can be downloaded from the IBRA website. This is our Sussex website and the Colos website, and I shall stop there.